Legends, welcome back to Here's Rodder's Reviews. I'm your host, Rodney Stewart. We're getting into Land of the Dead, episode 4 of Masters of the Universe Revelation. And this is the episode I was waiting on. Some slight spoilers did get through. And what happens to a main character happens in this episode. So if you haven't seen the show yet, spoilers, get out of this episode now. Go check out the series, and if you're interested, come back and hear my thoughts on it. But in Land of the Dead, of course, we are in Subternia at the start of this on the quest for the first half of the Power Sword, which, as we've seen in episode 1, was split in half in the final confrontation between He-Man and Skeletor. And yes, they're essentially in hell in this episode. And very swiftly into the episode, everyone gets separated. Teela ends up on her own. Orko and Evelyn are by themselves, and Andra, Beastman and Roboto are on their own, all in a different section of this hell that they're in. And we get to meet the main villain of this episode, who is the master of the underworld, essentially, Scareglow, and he appears as like a version of Skeletor, but he is voiced by Tony Todd, and it's brilliant to hear that voice coming out, like horror legend for him to be cast, and this is like essentially the devil himself. Is great. Basically, he offers the half of the Power Sword that's in Subternia to Teela in exchange for her fears, so she agrees to this, and but on top of that, the sword in the safe return of her friends, and she is dropped into a pit where she has to face her fears, and that is a fairly entertaining part of the episode. There's He-Man, a version of He-Man turns up, an evil version of him, and it goes into every sort of fear she has, and it's all linked into the secrets that have been kept from her entire life. And she's battling him, and eventually He-Man turns into the earlier version of Teela, and they fight with each other. And we discover that her fears are basically our fears of our future and our responsibilities, our destiny, essentially. And we get a tasty little bit at the end. If you know the history of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, there's going to be no real shock or surprise where Teela's character ends up at the end of the 10 episodes. Now, I have an idea where it's going to go, but getting there is going to be the interesting part. One of the most interesting critical reviews I heard of this show so far is a guy used the term that there's not enough He-Man in this. This is essentially Teela's quest. And I'm like, this guy has never watched a single episode of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. If he did, and he used the term, this is Teela's quest, he wouldn't be just as critical as he was. Now, what they're doing to kind of break off from the storyline of this episode briefly is what the Star Trek movies did in The Wrath of Khan. They went back to the original series, found an episode that they could tie into the movie, essentially The Wrath of Khan, continuation of the original Star Trek series. Basically what they're doing here, there's an episode entitled Teela's Quest, which, if memory serves, is episode 6 of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. We do find out who Teela is, where she came from, and what her destiny is at some point. And there's another episode later in the run that I haven't got a look at yet, but Teela's Triumph is another one that ties into that storyline. So Masters of the Universe Revelation is pulling heavily from those 2 episodes. So there's a section in the confrontation with Scareglow where Teela actually ends up using powers in Subternia that are very sorceress-like powers, and she actually calls the Power Sword herself, gets the half of it, and they think they're out at that point. But to jump over to what is, for me, the most important part of that episode was Orko. Now, they're split up into different sections of hell, alright? Roboto, Beastman, and Ander are fighting against a whole load of shadow demons. That's like, they pretty much spend the majority of the episode doing that. But the interesting part was the Orko and Evelyn interaction in this episode. Beautifully done. They are transported to the homeworld of Trala, essentially, the Orko's home planet, and they get a vision of the Tralan Spell of Springs, the Spell Spring, which is their source of magic and their essentially their life force of the Tralans. And there's no one there, it's completely deserted. And this is a vision that hell is giving them, but Orko was like, maybe this isn't a vision, maybe this is actually what's happening to the Tralans. And if that's the case, then I'm the last of the Tralans. And then he tells, the character of Orko is so well done. And as I say, I did drop a tear too, so I'm going to try not to get overly emotional in this episode myself, because it's just beautifully done where they go with Orko in this episode. Though it's surprisingly emotional for someone that was actually the target audience for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe back in the day. But Orko does say to Evelyn that his name's not really Orko, and some words when you're young are very hard to pronounce, and Evelyn puts the pieces together. Oracle. Your name was Oracle. Orko couldn't say Oracle, and then that kind of stuck whenever he was, he came across as like the clumsy half what that everybody knew him as back in the 80s, and he's like, Oracle, the name for all seeing, all knowing being, sort of a thing. And then, it didn't take them too long to realise how useless I actually am, sort of a deal. At which point they get attacked by this huge, giant shadow demon, and they're fighting that off. And Orko at one point is like, what are we going to do? Evelyn's magic staff isn't working. Magic's dying. She's almost out of energy. But I have skipped ahead and seen the last episode, so I think there was more to that than what was revealed in this episode. But basically, she's out of energy. She can't use her staff to fight off the shadow demon. And Orko was like, unless shadow demons can slip up in banana skins or, catching fire or something, I'm not going to be good to anybody. Everything I do is a mistake, I mess up everything. And a great line from Evelyn to Orko in this episode was like, that sounds like your parents talking. It's just like, you're letting the opinions of other people dictate who you are, essentially. And yes, at this point in the episode, to skip back to Teela, she's used the sorceress-like powers, and she's got the power sword, and she's able to reset everything that's happening to them in this realm, and they all end up back at where they began at, all together, reunited, and half the power sword. So Evelyn uses that to call up a gateway to Preternia, and as it opens, of course, Scareglow makes an appearance again, and he's using his powers to try and stop them from going through this gateway. And he brings up these like weeds out of the ground that wraps around their legs and then turns to stone. They're all trapped in place, but except for Orko, who of course can float, so he didn't get captured that way. But Orko turns his magic on Scareglow, and giving the other heroes time to escape at the end of the episode. And he's floating in midair, and he's got the two hands raised out in front of him, casting magical energy towards Scareglow, holding him back, deflecting his attacks. And the moment where it starts to sink in, where what's going to happen, is when he's standing, floating, I should say, with the two hands in the air, and he looks over his shoulder, And first of all, he speaks to Evelyn. He says, look, I'm doing it myself. And Tila's like, she's trying to tell him to hold on tight. We'll try and get you out of this. And Evelyn again tries to use her staff to back up the magical energy to help Orko, but again the staff doesn't work. She drops to the ground. She's used, essentially opening that doorway kind of drained her completely. But again, there was more to that magic staff not working than I think was given out in this episode. You'll see in the next one what happens. But she drops to the ground. Beastman lifts her. He carries her through the doorway. And Orko again looks over the shoulder and he tells Tila it's okay. He can't scare me. And it was at that point where I was just like, flashback to episode 1, whenever He-Man had the two parts of the power sword, split in half, and he's holding the energy of the galaxy in his own hands, and he changes back into Prince Adam, and Tila gets the rude awakening of who Prince Adam really was the entire time. And he looked over her shoulder just before the explosion that kills him. And again, now we have Orko doing that exact same thing. He's 2 hands in the air and he looks over the shoulder exactly the same way Prince Adam did. So this moment is like, shit, Orko's not getting out of this. And, Scareglow pushing through the magical energy that Orko was pressing out, and he grabs him by the neck, and Orko's like, closes down these 3 rings of energy, and he closes one down on the wrist of Scareglow and another one around his neck and body, and he's like, demon, get back to your hell, sort of thing, essentially. And then there's a huge explosion that blows the rest of the heroes out. Tila, Roboto and Andra through the doorway and to Paternia. And as they get back to their feet and look over to see what happens, you see the door starting to close and everything's caving in around it. And then the little scarf that Orko was wearing flutters out through the door, and the Tila's hand, he's sacrificed himself to save them. It's beautifully done, really, really beautifully done, and again, more emotional than I was expecting it to be. And at the end of the episode, Tila is angry because she's lost little Orko, and she's like, the partnership has failed. She's blaming Evelyn, this should have been you, and she's ready to start a fight. And at that point we hear a voice saying, Tila, and we turn around and there's Prince Adam standing. Essentially at the end of the episode, they've left hell, they're now in heaven, and of course they've met Prince Adam, because he's there, died, episode 1, they found him here, and he's like, by the power of Grayskull, he can't believe what he's seeing. And that's where the episode closes out. Now, there's been a lot of criticism for this series so far online. I've been checking out bits and pieces. Now that I've personally caught up, seen all the episodes, I'm letting a few of the reviews get in now, and people are, I think, getting more critical than they really should be for this series. It is definitely steeped in lore that's pre-existing. Again, if you check out those 2 old episodes, Tila's Quest and Tila's Triumph, you'll see exactly where the foundation for the story that they're trying to tell here came from. And yes, I can understand where the criticism is coming from. There's not enough He-Man. That's very much based on Tila. People have said that He-Man steps aside and Tila takes over the whole thing. That's not the case at all. I think now, when we get back into it, whenever we get the final 5 episodes, there's going to be more He-Man than you're going to be able to shake a stick at. It's essentially one huge story they're telling here. This isn't self-contained episodes like the original series was. But yes, it's fantastic. And really thinking back on it now, this episode is a day late, because as I said, it was a hugely emotional moment in the way that I did it for a fan of the original series. But Orko and I have said they were doing their best to redeem Orko in this series, what they essentially did there, and all the original ideas have been used up at this point. If you want to compare this episode and the ending to it to anything, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, do you remember the moment? You shall not pass. That's essentially what happened in this episode. Gandalf the Grey against that demon. You know, he sacrifices himself for the heroes to escape, and of course later on Gandalf the Grey comes back as Gandalf the White. So this isn't the last we have seen of Orko in this series, without a doubt. He has made the hero's sacrifice at this point, and you know, it is fantasy at the end of the day. Just because a character dies doesn't mean they're going to stay dead. So I got my little heart broken last night in that episode, but at the same time, if you only read between the lines and see where they're going with this, and you know where the foundation of the story came from, and just, you know, the universe in general, it's a very, very interesting story that I cannot wait to see the final 5 episodes too. But we're gonna get into episode 5 later this evening, if time lets me get it done today. So that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.